Hello everyone, today we talk about Ayyubid warfare. It's totally random, it has nothing to do with your many requests for me to cover this period in military, say in history, and of course mostly the armies of the Ayyubids. As you know, I made lots of videos about medieval Syrian warfare, also the Jazeera, Iraq. For example, today we will look at, ideally, at a guy from Mosul. That today is Iraq, but historically was part of the broader Syrian region. Besides, as you know, exactly in this point, and we recently made also videos about Saladin, the Battle of Marjayun, and so on. There is a lot of connection with Egypt and, of course, its specific military culture and all the intersections that, as you know, exist across these countries, also beyond the individual dynastic courses. For example, already at this point, you can perceive some Mamluk vibe, even though the Mamluks would mostly kick in later in the 13th century in a dynastic sense. But if you look at the sources that we used, for example, the Baptistère of Saint-Louis and the general outfit of these warriors in our historical military unit series, there are some similarities that today we'll try to highlight. However, today we also talk about an elite force, at least heavy cavalry, for 13th century standards. From, in fact, Ayyubid Syria, roughly the 20s of the 13th century under the rule of Sultan Al-Kamil. We are, as you know, in the West, the time of Frederick II, with the agreement for the Christian access to Jerusalem that was in part sort of militarily dismantled. Later, bad things will happen, including the Khwarezmians, ravaging of the city, etc. In any case, you understand how, here we are after Saladin, of course, how sort of already by a simple introduction, like different layers of military culture and influences emerge, all right? Heavy cavalry, I don't think we ever covered this for the region per se, but as far as medieval Syrian warfare is concerned, we talked about the Adat infantry. You know that medieval Syria had the most qualitative urban militias, at least of the Levant, right? Probably also of the Middle East, for different reasons. These guys were specialized also in different functions, such as, military engineering, launching fire grenades, building catapults, and so on. So imagine, because in this sense, I'm not, say, a particular expert in the medieval Syrian army, and I don't think that historiographically there is actually even a work overall that considers it, at least in more flagrant and colorful ways, the ways we are habituated on Schwerpunkt, the Syrian army in its completion as a whole. Very often you find just a history, and rightly so, a history of politics, of campaigns, but focusing on the fact that this was properly a region with its own specific characteristics, its own very intense influences from everywhere, from the Caucasus, from the Kurds, the Ayyubids being fundamentally also stemming from that background, the Cilician Armenians, the Byzantines, the Franks, the same Egyptians, the Arabs, the Italians, and more, right? You understand what kind of, and here basically the Mongols were also starting to appear. In fact, when you look at the Mamluks, there was actually a very strong, more Central Asian steppe vibe as opposed to what had been, at least up until Fatimid in part of Ayyubid history, like, of course, a more sort of Arab-based kind of military institution and fundamentals. I made videos about Fatimid warfare, but we will have to prepotently come back on those as well. Besides, as we know in general from our videos also about the region, as you know, I'm completing by this point that branch of the cycle will be exhausted soon. The overview about all the regions of Eurasia and North Africa between the 11th and 14th century. We're finishing the far eastern side of the story. I think we lack eastern Iran, right? But we covered Syria, the Jazeera, and Iraq. We sort of profiled, of course, these countries that we haven't discussed otherwise for other civilian matters throughout the Middle Ages, if not in very general and sort of superficial ways for how superficial Schwerpunkt standards can be considered, of course. And, of course, we have acknowledged how the Syrian political landscape at this point was marked by a fragile balance of power, right? The same difficulties that already even the victorious Saladin and at this point Sultan Al-Kamil were facing in maintaining especially like essentially a two-country system, by the way, which countries, like, and exposed to how different and exposed how to different centrifugal and also forces, and also, of course, externally threatening ones in general. With the Ayyubid dynasty consolidating control, or at least trying to maintain this over the former Fatimid and Zengid territories, while navigating tensions with the Crusader states that were still there, because Jerusalem, as we've seen, was of course Muslim, but basically Al-Kamil has to broker a deal with Frederick II for some sort of power sharing of sort. Made lots of videos about Frederick II and the issues that this agreement triggered for the papacy, and naturally wanted a glorious, bloody reconquest of Jerusalem. For not talking about the internal rivalries among Ayyubid princes themselves. Today we will not, of course, descend into the difficulties, let's say, of Ayyubid, etc., also the complexities of Ayyubid policy in general. And you know that these countries had historically been less feudal than the West, but definitely pretty much all over here. There's a Latin Empire controlling Constantinople, for example, but in general, Levant was significantly influenced by the Franks in many ways. There had been, from the so-called the time of the so-called Islamic Golden Age, an erosion of public authority. Right, the older caliphates were fundamentally based on an idea of a more or less central states, by the time standards of developed bureaucracy, a permanent army, and much of these forces of the system, of the structures, had been fundamentally eroded over time. Egypt was well placed. Right, the Ayyubids were essentially the greatest power in the Levant. They were actually the dominant force, especially after the fall of Jerusalem, after the Battle of Athens that I made a video on. And yet, the broader, cohesive factors like that would hopefully keep all these enormous territories together were not enough to profile this power as a strongly unitary, sort of orderly one. It's a very different picture from the West, right? That was fragmented and feudalized, etc., but paradoxically had in that feudal glue an incredibly strong foundation for statal monarchic development, and things were much tidier in Western Europe in particular, compared to these powers that, however, were enormous. Right, but the tendency to fragmentation, to privatization happened in these countries as well, and it accelerates, as a matter of fact, especially with further Central Asian, Turkic, and Mongol influences that will essentially impact all these countries out there. More or less, this Mediterranean powers were way more influenced by Europe, again, especially Egypt, Syria, even to a degree. Had also, especially a strong Byzantine legacy, were, again, more civil systems in some ways, especially what had been the bulk of the Abbasid power that at this point was about to be wiped out by the Mongols for good, was instead much more decadent. It would finally be further basically destroyed as statehood. It was much more influenced by Persian feudalism. As a matter of fact, in Egypt, instead, would stand out as the most orderly and sort of better administered country out there. The Mamluks will end up stopping also the Mongol advance. In Syria, we will talk about those encounters. We talked already about Mamluk warfare. That, of course, was very much to develop in the wake of this great Egyptian and Syrian statal military sort of cultural tradition. A lot to sort of digress on in theory, but we will not do this. Let's keep it tidy. Let's just observe that, of course, we're looking at powers that were quite equilibristically put together, or held together at least, and that, of course, required an intense military effort. And no power at this point in history, worth of this name, is such without a heavy bulk of heavy cavalry that can take the field, especially against the strongest heavy cavalry around, which is the Latin one, right? The Franks, the Crusaders, had really impacted the same Islamic warfare in ways that we tend sort of to underestimate. This is especially instead evident if you look at Egyptian warfare. And so here and in Syria as well, we can appreciate a bit that world, right? The Syrians, as we've seen, they have a slightly higher military quality than other surrounding Islamic powers. They are habituated to be on the frontier for a longer time. This, of course, will not help eventually sort of stabilizing a local Syrian power per se, right? On the longer run, Egypt is by far the greater bulk that hegemonizes this entire area. However, the Ayyubid prince's military retinue is what we're looking at right now, essentially, as this type of troopers. I hope you really like that. This is actually a very accurate reconstruction in general. Like, there isn't a huge difference between heavy cavalrymen, especially the more elite they were in terms of general appearance, right? In the early 13th century, in this third Mediterranean context and beyond. But I would like to stress that every AI picture that I make is not just original. It's not really copied from any publishing, any kind of, you can't see this image overlapping with another one elsewhere. But I make a great effort, also because I have the time to do this without much commitment, frankly, to the thing, by selecting the images, the models that really are correct, accurate. This is my own art, you can say, aside from the obvious AI sort of filter to that. And so you can take this for accurate and fundamentally exemplificative of an Ayyubid Syrian heavy cavalryman from Mosul in the 20s of the 13th century. And the reason why I decide sometimes to say, exactly from this place, of course, it's just for spicing that up. But fundamentally, yes, it does reflect space, as we will see now, on actual historical, archaeological sources that tell us, of course, how these guys fought. And of course, there were lots of variations, especially in styles, in the details, and so on. However, the fundamentals are the ones of pretty sound heavy cavalry. Ibn Ubayr's travelogue notes that Damascus and Aleppo were key administrative centers of Ayyubid Syria, with Mosul serving, and that's why I chose this, prevalently as a vital military hub under Ayyubid governor Badr al-Din Lulu, who maintained a standing army to counter Seljuk incursions. This is very relevant because, as you know, the Seljuks at a point had sort of control of these areas, but the Zengids, the Ayyubids, had historically emerged to essentially establish their own dynasty and exploiting the local military system. So in the east, there were, as we were saying before, lots of the more heavily Persified areas. The Seljuks were to essentially decay in the 13th century, and as you know, they had conquered an enormous amount of land initially in the 11th century, but they had also fragmented and decentralized because of their eminently feudal and autonomous background. So, of course, this heavy cavalryman would have witnessed a very wide array of enemies that we listed before, with Mosul being a cornerstone for, in fact, that kind of strategic organization of probably the northeastern frontier of Ayyubid power, that at some point we will dissect better again in other videos. It is true that I haven't made many videos about this, but it's completely random. And in fact, if you see what I always say, what doesn't come before will later, and just recently made a video about the Battle of Marjayoun just by stats, right? It was more likely to have more concentrated Ayyubid content by random cyclical extraction, as I used to do, because of mathematical likelihood, right? And so we will cover the Ayyubid army in all its might in different videos, including this ones. Militarily, the Ayyubids relied on a professional corps of Mamluks and tribal levies, with cavalry units like this warrior forming an elite contingent, as described in the Kitab al-Ibar, which records Al-Kamil's use of heavily armored horsemen to fight intense clashes like at Damietta in 1219. The siege of Damietta 1218-1219 was a key event during the Fifth Crusade, where Crusader forces aimed to capture the Egyptian port city of Damietta as a strategic base to eventually take over the lower Nile Valley, and from there to essentially seize Jerusalem. This will be essentially the Crusader strategy, especially, as you know, with Saint Louis in later time. And led by figures like John of Brienne, King of Jerusalem, and supported by European powers, including the Holy Roman Empire and the Papacy, the Crusaders besieged the city starting in May 1218. Damietta was heavily fortified, however, and the siege dragged on for over a year due to fierce resistance from the Ayyubid defenders under the Sultan Al-Kamil. The Crusaders faced challenges like disease, supply shortages, and internal disputes, but managed to capture the city in November 1219 after breaching its defenses, aided by innovative tactics and siege engines. The victory came at a high cost with significant casualties, and the Crusaders' subsequent advance stalled, leading to negotiations and eventual withdrawal from Egypt in 1221. The siege highlighted, of course, the broader strategic difficulties and limited long-term success of the Fifth Crusade. Socially, Ibn al-Wardi reports that urban military elites in Mosul enjoyed patronage from Ayyubid rulers living in fortified citadels and training in furuziyya, that is, horsemanship and martial exercises, essentially a level of knighthood and chivalry that, especially in this eastern frontier, was sort of more feudally and aristocratically pronounced than elsewhere, elevating the status of these communities above the rural tribal warriors. Of course, again, the elite professional element, that is the one we are describing here, was the most private, let's say, feudally profiled. They were essentially landowners. They owed military service to technically those who had theft them in a way or another in these lands. In fact, they were not necessarily full landowners, but they were at least entrusted this. Well, also in sort of more durable and less reversible fashion than in for example, the Egyptian Ikta system that, as you know, was something similar to the Byzantine pronoia, and that basically entailed this sort of overall public ownership of the land, which in theory was not simply inheritable, right, as a sort of a laudium like you see in the West. There would be much to say about this, because when you actually look at how the system worked, you realize that even the capacities of the Byzantines or the Muslims to enforce any sort of authority to reclaim this land were normally failing, right? This is not why the systems had even been created in the first place. We discussed this last month when talking about feudalism, the vassalatic beneficiary system. What is the deal here, right? If anything, what is more characteristic of these lands, and especially the more times go on with the Mamluks, in particular, we will see this transition towards ever more sort of cyclically resettling mechanisms and dynamics, is the fact that different land that was nominally at least belonging to the Sultanate and or the sort of public domain, in fact, would be settled by military communities that were in fact one of these essentially slave soldiers. At least if we talk about the Mamluks, the term gulam is basically a synonym. It's just like a different etymology. These things were going on actually in the region for centuries, and basically consisted in getting these foreigners that were often also non-free, and even though not all the Mamluks were actually slaves. That in any and slavery here is, especially at these military levels, much more sort of connected with the concept of Islamic subjugation rather than a de facto, because there were other proper slaves that were 100% like things, right, disposed of by others. Here it's more like a sort of toxic relation of clientery connection that mostly revolved around the fact that since these guys were in fact non-freemen technically, or at least there was a spectrum of that, where you could be a serf as opposed to a slave, for example. That would be a better term in this case. You and a foreigner, you depended on the local power that installed you there, and mostly it was the sultanial one. We've seen similar things, I don't know, pick Hungary and how they settled the steppes of refugees at the time of the Mongol invasions to counter the local Magyar oligarchy, right? Nobility, for the sake of governability. The Ayyubids worked in very similar ways. The same dynasty had begun themselves in that way. The Mamluks will be the ones that were properly starting and eventually identifying, as the name defines the concept by itself, as those slave soldiers in charge eventually of the entire system. It's as if, I don't know, in Germany, the ministeriales had taken over, right? And that's why, as I was saying before, these Muslim lands are much more messed up and disordered and in many ways. And literally, these systems would be able to perpetuate some political stability thanks to this cyclical import of slaves and settlement as military colonists that gradually would also gentrify, settle down in a wider way, and then therefore weaken and sort of overthrown by fresher, hungrier, more primitive people coming literally from the steppes. Some of these people were even, I don't know, Slav, right? There were lots of, I don't know, blonde, blue-eyed Mamluks. Considering the heavy Indo-European ancestry, a great part of what were now nominally Turkic steppes, but actually had, not really changed that much of their genetic composition over the centuries. Doesn't matter how, of course, incredibly even more messed up that world was, right? But it's quite fascinating because, of course, there were different levels of soldierly, and of course, here we're looking at even some kind of this. There were some elite Mamluk forces that would be just like this heavy cavalryman. That would be some sort of kind of proper national freemen, noblemen that of the land, mixed of different origins, by the way. Because at some point, even the concept of serfdom would be surpassed in certain cases, or at least you couldn't simply track it. It's not like there were IDs, modern sort of ancestral recording, all this stuff. And that's how complicated the picture is. But it was somehow effective because these powers managed to inject fresher forces in that way and stabilizing in these ways what they couldn't stabilize in a more permanent direction. I explained, however, partially how the, if I'm not wrong, made properly video about the Mamluk army organization, which should, so we're talking especially the later period, and I made it, even though it was like for the last generations of the Mamluks for the Renaissance, say probably late 15th, beginning of the 16th century era. I made, however, some videos about Mamluk tactics from the 14th to 15th centuries. They're very close, actually, as I was saying. Yes, I made it. Mamluk army organization from 1250 to 1350. So you understand how close it was, of course, chronologically, to the period that we're looking at today. And there you can easily see how the mechanism worked and have sort of clear ideas of how it was essentially fully systematized in the Mamluk dynastic period, but already under the Ayyubids, things tended to work like that as well. So this, we talked a lot about the tribal warriors at the outskirts of the Islamic civilization. These were often, think about the Gadzis, living in the mountains and the frontier areas, very sort of warlike and but brutal and primitive and militarily actually cheap in a sense. Troops, especially from a technical point of view. And those places would have also provided with heavy cavalry by some degree. Normally they were lighter forces, mostly ever, especially throughout the 13th century with the Mongol invasions, ever sort of lighter horse archers type. And the Mamluks, again, are much more that compared to the Ayyubids that, again, mostly stemmed from at least a more sedentary background, at least in the essence of military culture. It doesn't matter how much the Ghulams, the Mamluks, had affected the Islamic way of war and how much the Seljuks, for example, as we were saying before, had taken over the entire system in the previous centuries and so on. So this Ayyubid warrior from Mosul around the 20th to the 13th century, as you can see, is a heavily armored horseman equipped for close combat, to say the least, and shock charges and all the heavy cavalry package, representing a numerical minority, yet the backbone of Ayyubid troops. As in Europe, heavy cavalry, of course, was the decisive arm. These peoples relied on some more combined armed tactics, preferring, as we've seen in countless videos about, including Marjayun, by the way, that is just from a few decades before this, cooperation with light cavalry as opposed to infantry, compared to the Westerners that had essentially just infantry, heavy cavalry and heavy infantry, and just a minority amount of missile troops, mostly on foot. However, as we explained in those videos about the Hadat, for example, the Syrian urban militias were particularly good, and they were also treasured, especially as far as siege warfare was concerned. So in open field, indeed, these cavalrymen here would have been mostly the maintaining the upper hand. But in general, as we've seen, for example, in the siege of Damietta, you can imagine a big deal, of course, of infantry support. And the Ayyubids, especially from Egypt and Syria, in fact, were pretty well put in terms of infantry forces compared to especially Middle Eastern powers. The primary armor of this cavalryman is the famous kazagand, a kilted hip-length garment with mail sleeves derived from the Persian parallel term. You can spell it, I think in this context, exactly the same way with a U instead than an A after K at the beginning. Otherwise, it would be K-U-Z-A-G-H-A-N-D. It's a very famous type of armor, and the term likely further evolved in the Western Gazagans, from which Yazerand almost certainly originated. As you know, this term essentially refers to at least the Western version of the term that is applied sometimes even to, Japanese jackets and things like that, and that essentially indicated sort of brigandine, basically. And again, with as a military historian specializing in the Middle Ages, I'm not fussy at all as far as the categorization of this armor, the relative terminology, deterministic terminological approach is, given that it seems to me that the only pop cultural references to medieval warfare is just guys dressing up as medieval warriors and claiming, expertise in the art of war that has absolutely nothing to do with whatever they're doing, but not even close. Like it's a completely different and overwhelmingly bigger by scale topic that has nothing to do with HEMA reenactment. And in fact, as you can immediately understand why they're not mentally there, really, is that they fixate just with definitions without knowing that actually at the time, even just definitions could vary so much depending on different contexts, and the same categorization of a pre-uniform or standardized types of armament was not really a thing, right? You can, of course, approximate that, but there were so many different solutions, and in ways that we can't even properly document. I mean, lots of videos about all these various regions, arms and armor. And as you can see, both iconographically and archaeologically, there's a wide variety of arms and armor that were all sort of customized. They depended on so many different factors: personal, contingental, social, economical, just fashionable or cultural, provided that, of course, there was always a military logic and functionality behind each and every of these choices. And so the Khazagand is essentially an early form of brigandine, which in this sense had always existed to some degree. What is the Frankish, the Carolingian Brune, the Bernie? Consisting of male corselet enveloping in cloth and silk, kilted and adorned with an outer layer of embroidered material or brocade. This is what we get, especially from these Mesopotamian sources, right? Ibn Khaldun records that Khazagans were often reinforced with small iron plates sewn between the fabric layers, enhancing protection without sacrificing flexibility. Consider that Western Europeans were now to fully, so organically develop plate armor, right, in ways that naturally had existed in Asia, where that was already employed, but that would develop in some more sort of comprehensively heavy fashion that the Easterns would not quite develop in the same way. And so when you look at this type of armor, you realize that this was just adapting to the average, that, as we explained, especially as every type of combat was tendentially lighter than the West. So obviously having more agile knights that prefer also to recur to the hit and run tactics and or to sort of greater maneuverability or distance, or even using missile weapons at some point, is not much a matter of some strange alchemy behind that, but simply because they didn't have as heavy cavalry as the feudal West and all its sort of also places where feudalism was not particularly healthy, but still was were particularly advanced altogether. Something, again, that these societies, Indies, did not quite have in the orderly, civilly sort of developed and sort of structured ways that we had in the West at that point. This is very interesting, right? So if we are to stereotype, of course, this guy today, this is very heavy, right? And it's very heavy also by Western standards. However, there were all sort of halfways in between, and properly for the heavy cavalry. Historical accounts, such as those from Al-Tartuzi, suggest it was an invention of Eastern Syrian of Iraqis. Suggests the Khazagand was an invention of Eastern Syrians of Iraqis, which is naturally anecdotal, as we've seen. The concept behind essentially brigandine existed from quite a while, but it's significant that within the Islamic world, this area of East Syria, of Mosul, would result as the place of origin, or at least where the brigandine was better made, all right, which may have been connected with sort of the warlike establishment of the province. Al-Maqrizi describes Fatimid Khazagans ornamented with brocade and silver stars, likely rivets securing the armor. There was all a symbolism behind this, by the way, as the rising star, this nascent, together with crescent, etc., was a pretty old symbol in the region. I made some videos about this sort of de facto heraldic, if not proto-heraldic topics. A detailed account from Usama also describes his father's Khazagand, which comprised two coats of mail. A long Frankish one, beneath a shorter waist-length mail layer, lined internally with felt, padded with rabbit hair and silk, and covered externally with felt, the wool ensemble kilted. This is, of course, an excellent armor. It combines basically the double, again, that we were talking before, the sort of the Western heaviness. Of course, there were even up to 3 layers of armor. The Byzantines had historically pioneered that, at least in the Nicephorian cataphract era, sort of that extended actually up to a few generations before, like the Komnenian era here, say at least the mid-12th century. Naturally, that was the ultra-heaviest thing. Its traumatic cost made it sort of prohibitive, especially for smaller powers. But of course, when you, at least to have a consistently numerous force that could also have just simply the resources, mostly statally controlled, like in that case of Constantinople, for properly training and fielding such forces, conceived essentially to steamroll everything you had in front of you, except at great, for example, limits of maneuverability in some ways. So there was not like the ultimate groundbreaker. At least, again, warfare is unpredictable in many ways. But indeed, the double layer is something you are looking at happening in Europe at this point more often, with plate starting to appear and over mail, and before solutions contemplating mostly that there were actually, and these also had something like that, of plate and mail in a single armor. So where there wasn't, as it developed also in later generations in some cases, so that where there wasn't mail, there was plate, and they weren't simply superimposed, right? This we'll have to look at the development of plate armor in greater complexity in this kind of, especially in the knightly historical military units series for that. But essentially, you have here, of course, the lower, say the mail essentially would wear underneath, being longer and more protective, anatomically wide, and called Frankish exactly because it was normally like made of mail, right? As here the same source tells us. By the way, mail had been out there from a very long time, right? The Indo-Europeans had spread that pretty far and wide across the steppes. And even though we have the idea of the properly lamellar as far as everything Eastern is concerned, this is not quite always the case, especially admittedly for lighter type of troops. And in this case, of course, you would have, in fact, a this outer armor that the source says also being essentially mail, but so overall also increasingly protected by some kilted armor, padded one underneath. So you would have some, if not several, with at least if you had 3 levels of metal armor, layers of protection. But you would also have, as I used in the picture, by the way, properly lamellar, right, corselets that mostly cover just the torso, right, protecting the torso, and could be worn under, again, different types of protection that at that point could vary and really depended on the soldier, on the wearer, and this could also go as far as different times of the battle were concerned. Again, there is not really one armor that you can wear simply as the best solution in each circumstance. Circumstances change, and as such, you have to be able to adapt to a degree that, again, you will know only if you are in actual combat. I mean, there were people, even in Europe, in Central, Northern Europe, in summer, stripping themselves of armor because it was too hot to fight in that. You can imagine in Syria during the good season what kind of heat like this cavalrymen had to endure. By the way, there is this idea that you see, especially when talking about Crusader armor and how this compared with, say, in ultra-mare context with the ones at home in Europe. And so the one that armor used in the Levant was overall lighter because of the weather. This is possible. I mean, it's possible that obviously at parity of conditions, the weather does cause some change. But it seems that the main reason was as we were illustrating before, also generally speaking social, right? And even the Franks that settled themselves in, say, Jerusalem didn't really have in loco the actual means to maintain a feudal supplying system as they had home. And so in general, they adapted also to some lighter type of fighting, just like the one of their enemies were. So that paradoxically, of course, the Muslims became a bit heavier because of the Crusades, and the Crusaders there at least became a bit lighter. But none of these peoples really had to be told how to fight by anyone. It would simply adapt to the best circumstances that were always modulated and flexible, also pretty much everywhere they fought and wherever they came from. So this mechanistic and deterministic, also materialistic and technologistic obsession from where did they get what, how they fought by standard is not a good indicator of sort of general expertise in the art of war. Padding is naturally underrated because we don't have as much archaeological evidence for it as for metal armor, but as we understand, also for antiquity, even more, it was much more out there than we think. There are atrocious debates online regarding the half empty or full glass that I'm not going to enter, and that, of course, it is this lighter profile of fighter used sort of more organic protection than, say, the Westerners that were sort of more coriaceous and sort of metal faced, sort of in general appearance and combat techniques. Ibn al-Athir notes that the Khazagand featured an upstanding collar, and while it often lacked sleeves, this warrior's version, let's say, includes them. This element is fascinating. Collars were, as we'll see now, also other solutions such as aventails, right? But there are different circumstances also in Europe where an increased level of missile fire does develop particular collar solutions that basically were obviously aiming at protecting this quite vital part of the body. We see it, for example, we see it pretty much everywhere. I mean, at some point this collar armor existed everywhere, but for example, the Italians had a lot of that because of the most intense volume of crossbow fire. The Serbians had that in, say, more characteristic ways, because they lived at the end of the corridors of the steppes along the Danube Valley, and they received a lot of sort of the most aggressive and daring sort of element, say, nomads of the steppes that made use of a lot of archery. We talked about all these various regions, so you know more or less what we're talking about. So it's unsurprising that someone fighting with sort of heavier gear like the guy we're looking at today would develop in such areas that were definitely using missile fire from in quite consistent fashion, to say the least, from a very long time, into general Middle Eastern influence from the steppes since time immemorable, would complete their protection with some particular collars, right, and or aventails. The aventails especially spread during the Mongol era as a tendency, but of course they would have already existed. The Vasiyat al-Muluk, a 13th century military treatise, specifies that Khazagans were sometimes dyed with indigo or saffron to signify rank among Ayyubid officers. Of course, colors that I added here, and I think they're very important because we tend to forget how colorful the Middle Ages actually were, and especially medieval armies. This is splendid, in fact, sight in open field, I'd say pretty much wherever they fought, had very strong symbolical, psychological, and cultural implications, including, in fact, the military ones of recognition of rank, of command. There is all superimposition of that, right? Especially in countries where this is not much the case, probably for the heavier troops. They were all colors. In the West, actually, male was more often color than we think, even in colors like blue, red, green, etc. I think, I don't remember whether I ever made a video about that, but it was way more frequent than we normally think. The burned ones were prevented here from rusting in by different degrees. And again, we will talk about this technicalities better in another video dedicated to armor. But in the East, especially the lighter troops were more less properly ordered and required some kind of more self-evident form of recognition on the battlefield to be more functionally expandable. But this would apply to the heavies as well. By 1280, Khazagans used by Syrian Arabs at Homs were covered in red satin and brocade, and Kalkashandi, writing in the 14th century, records that such coverings were typically red or yellow brocade. As you understand, this fabric, before we talk even about silk, had a minimal protective capacity, especially the latter, right? Silk, we were talking about it the other day when it was about Far East Asian warfare. And yes, for the same Japanese, for which they're sort of most famous for. In that context, in fact, general lack of metal, right, in the Japanese archipelago. And so in this case, for example, in the Levant, as we've seen, not really because there was a shortage of metal. Think about the Damascene sort of blades that were possibly influenced by especially the Indian woods, steel construction, etc. That is also a bit, again, that's not descending to determinism. The point was that these were not properly feudal cultures, and as such, even in these heaviest cavalry prototypes, they had tendentially less armor, and so they tended to compensate with, as we were saying, organic armor. By the 14th century, Saracen brigandines, now called Karkal, adopted a European style, by the way, with iron or steel laminae riveted together, becoming the most prevalent form of Mamluk body armor. And in that sense, you do have some European influence as well, as definitely Europeans were making the type of armor more not standard, because again, there is also properly plate armor in more comprehensive form. Also, the brigandine has plates inside, but again, it's more flexible and it has sort of different tactical implications behind that. Essentially, the heavier guys have ever more plate armor, but you need someone on the field to assist them in more flexible fashion. So it's, say, this style becomes just more typical for different reasons. And unfortunately, we can't simply track in a systemic sense. They say, why wasn't this armor more around in the early 13th century as opposed to the 14th, right? In part was also due to the fact that depending on, first of all, what kind of society we look at, it's well possible that the Mamluk Sultanate, in its statal success, would provide with more arms and armor to its own soldiers at this point, as professionalization was actually kicking in these wars as well, especially with the late medieval crisis as well. So paradoxically, brigandines of that level of sophistication were something newer, something more exquisitely crafted for that type of specialistic warfare. And in previous times, solutions had been more primitive and or less, again, iconic, for not talking about the fact that there might have been just less wealth around, and or especially in this sense, there would have been less, there would have been more evenly distributed effect, and in turn the entire military quantities that you would have seen on the battlefield. So it's a bit complicated, and trying even to make the math of it is quite historically unlikely. In any case, in addition to the Khazagand, some Ayyubid warriors, as depicted in contemporary sources, wore lamellar corselets, as we were saying, also male hauberks, as we've seen before, with these different layers and all. Again, this was worn over padded armor of some sort for just the usual comfort and especially protection of the rider. Again, padded armor, especially when there is a lot of missile around, it's always useful, right? But especially in these contexts where there is less metal, right, it can't really absorb a whole lot of piercing. Even though it's technically it's better against kind of cuts of some sort, something less penetrating. But given that arrows arrive at different angles and generally speaking spent, if you're fighting against the Mongols and their arrow showers that could surpass the million in the larger engagements with armies of 30,000 men, they would do miracles in many ways. And again, considering the Central Asian influence that already exists in this region since Seljuk times and before, all this armor was already designed to fundamentally withstand that kind of missile power. This cavalryman we're looking at would don a relatively large iron lamellar cuirass over his mail hauberk. And as you can see, it's a quite compact sight, right? It does give you the idea properly of the courageousness and the heaviness of the trooper. His helmet could possibly be of European origin, by the way. This is not so strange. Again, in Syria, there would have been a lot of Frankish influence. Again, the Egyptians, the Syrians as well would always be connected with Western markets, with the Italian trade that was on the forefront also in terms of technological items. We've seen in the video about the Adath that the Yanuviya shields, similar to pavises, even though conceptually it's wrong to attach the pavis to that particular design per se, because it has mostly to do with the thickness, not much with the extent of the shield. Witnesses to the fact that Western weapons were properly conceived as such, as in properly the local adaptations and or imports, right? There is this overwhelming sort of obsession that even very famous scholars push, like Nicole, for example, that the West took everything from the East, that there hadn't been the Crusades, that the Europeans would have been just some primitive brutes with nothing. The more you study this period at all levels, the more you realize how the West had already been far more advanced, even especially in terms of armor. And even specific technologies were developed pretty much in parallel with the East, not much because of a contact with that. And some of the fundamentals had always been there also from antiquity. So it's a bit of a mirage to presume that especially the East had much to teach for the West in terms of military technology, even in, say, the higher Middle Ages. This type of helmet would that you see here features here actually in the picture you can't see it because the guy is turned, but it would feature, let's say, no, I actually showed it a little, yeah. In fact, a solid iron nape-guard, a common feature during this period. This is quite fascinating. It actually shows not just the obvious need for generalized protection in an environment characterized by heavy missile fire, but also the fact that these guys were a bit more akin to Western fighters as far as blows from up to down, right, were concerned while mounted, right? Not just from the same Crusaders, but from these guys as well. They would wield pretty big swords and properly trying to break themselves against this helmet in the hope, of course, of smashing the head of the guy underneath. The Kitab al-Diryaq, that is a 12th century manuscript, illustrates Ayyubid helmets with nape guards forged from a single iron piece, by the way, which was a very advanced way of doing so. So there is actually a very interesting prehistory of this kind of models, also later developed in the later Middle Ages with nape guards and everything. We've seen a lot of that in Spain with sort of prodromes to what would have been, for example, the salad and other forms of also bassinets with some developed nape guards that you would see, for example, in Italy or in German in later times. It would be very interesting to track this in terms of possible Islamic origins of some sort. Definitely the Muslims in their broader picture, because here we're looking at Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Mongols, etc., had an enormous equestrian, chivalric, and knightly and feudal culture in their own way. So again, the need of having heavy armor, regardless of their lighter sort of average rider, was pretty much there, actually, especially from the Central Asian influences. The elite of the steppes is incredibly heavily armored. It's sometimes even more heavily armored than the average one of the Senator award, except it's smaller. And indeed, areas like the Levant, like the Middle East, before receiving an overwhelming Turco-Mongol influence, had stuck essentially to the Iranian origin, the sort of in fact, this essentially chivalric, more tendentially sedentary, also in the later Indo-European steppes period, that, for example, included straight blades, this more kind of straightforwardly championed, kind of hand-to-hand, direct frontal clash type of cavalry that gets a bit diluted, in fact, during the waves of Turks and Mongols of the following century. Nevertheless, we see indeed that the Ayyubids had quite advanced arms and armor. They had, by the way, their own arsenals, their own early capacity to provide with some relatively standardized equipment, especially to their soldiery. Here we're looking at something that is truly more elite, but there would have been similarly armored guys, just at a slightly lower level, that would have been provided with armor by their own masters and also by the broader Ayyubid sort of statal architecture. It doesn't matter how sort of fluid and imperfect it would be, right? Kalkashandi describes two types of Migfar helmets along the conical Baida, so named for its egg-like shape. Baida meaning exactly that, egg. One Migfar variant included a male aventail, known as Migfar al-Zard, while the other, likely older, has a solid neck guard, as possibly depicted in a mid-14th century edition of Joinville's memoirs. It's difficult to find in a copyrighted, commercially expandable fashion, so unfortunately we can't provide all the information here, but say there are relatively minor differences. It's interesting that we're talking about Joinville and reading from his work, especially by describing, in fact, the crusades of Saint Louis against Egypt and the fighting there. So looking at how firsthand what the Saracens looked like in combat. I recently made a video about the Battle of Taillebourg, of which the young Joinville was a source at the time. So Imad ad-Din also references helmets with neck guards. So again, it's interesting that possibly also due to Western influences and other local military logics, like panoplological reasons, the Mamluks fought with this solid neck protection that you wouldn't otherwise find in that rigid fashion in many other places, at least so characteristically like in this case. Alternative helmet designs are illustrated in two versions of William of Tyre's History of Outremer that were produced in Acre around the 80s of the 13th century. I made a video about properly Outremer warfare and arms and armor, using properly lots of illustrations from William of Tyre's illuminations, right? So I also made a video about the fall of Acre in 1291. There we described essentially what the Mamluks fought like at the time, but still from this Syrian and Egyptian background. The William of Tyre's History of Outremer's versions of helmet designs incorporate nozzles alongside nape guards, right? And so yet another pretty universally understandable type of protection. This would suggest, yet again, a bit of a greater chivalric, knightly, sort of direct impact, kind of smashing nature of this more Mediterranean part of the Islamic world because of the very heavy influences that were coming from Europe. And generally speaking, the sort of more sedentary outlook of even this very heavily influenced steppes areas, again, especially Egypt, Syria, would remain largely sedentary, very much more statal than parts of the Middle East, for example. And there were, by the way, the military powers out there were solidly based on a pretty impressive net of cities, of all sort of Semitic, Hellenistic, Roman bases and further. So this had developed during the Arab times as well. A bit of a different sort of environment compared to the Turco-Mongols further east. This is something we'll later characterize the same Ottomans against, say, the Safavids, for example. Usama, the previous source describing his father's 12th century armor, but we are more or less, as you understand, also generational in these times, mentions a Muslim helmet with a nozzle as well. Some sources refer to visors, likely indicating male aventails or coif, actually, such as the male coif covering all but the eyes, as seen in the video about the Mamluks panoply from the Baptistère de Saint-Louis. Even though we talked about the sort of medium type of Mamluk fighter that wouldn't be so heavy, so we will actually make a video about the heavier type and discussing in particular the aventail that, as we were hinting at before, something spreading more decisively in the age of, in fact, of the Mongol invasion. In fact, the Mamluks come around the mid-13th century and were there, right? St. Louis enterprises were happening pretty much in that time, and there it is, right? So a context where you have really to parry a lot, right? The reason why the Mongols spread the aventail more is that they came from places where missile fire was even more intense and pernicious than it was, for example, like Mesopotamia in the Mediterranean. If anything, with lots of arrows around that obliged, you see, not much, say, the Westerns developed de facto plate armor for protecting their faces from blank impact, right? The Mongols are more caring about arrows at the end of the day and prefer to use mail because this is essentially what aventails are usually made of, but also of scale, etc. So it really depends. There's lamellar aventail. We've seen it in videos about the different regions, especially in Persia, where the Ilkhanids will establish themselves. But in any case, you have the historical military unit video already made for some, at least, Mamluk figures from the Baptistère de Saint-Louis. You will find this videos links in the top fixed comment down below as well. But also extra protection at the end of the day. Similar coif appear in other Muslim sources as early as the 13th century. This, again, would have existed before, but there is in this also certain Western influence, and especially in these areas that, as we've seen, were more like Europe. This coif appears occasionally worn without a helmet as well, which, again, it's something you find in the West at different times, suggesting, by the way, again, that Islamic proclivity to lighter kind of combat. It happens. It would have not been so strange, by the way, to see, we've seen it in the video, for example, about the fall of Acre, to see European knights as slaves becoming Mamluks after their capture during the loss of the complete loss of the Outremer possessions, right? So, of course, this is not to say that they would literally maintain their own personal armor in that sense, but I mean, there was a lot, even just later, of sort of personalization, customization, lots of Western influences throughout all the periods, not like Acre falls. By the way, there is some other stronghold, minor one, still in Crusaders' hands that will take some other years to fall. But in general, like there is a lot of broader material, cultural, political, and even religious influence from areas. By the way, think about the Cilicians. Think about the same Byzantines. Again, there is a great melange, a great mix. All right. The Mamluks stabilized things a great deal. The Ayyubids already had been sort of heading toward that direction. The aforementioned Baida helmets were often painted, which is absolutely common in medieval times. At some point, lacquered, proper imaging, modern motorcycle helmets like of the shiniest type, they were exactly what they looked like. We know it pretty well from all information available pretty much everywhere. Some helmets, like Saladin's own, were gilded, which also makes a lot of sense. Our warrior's helmet here includes a mail aventail covered with silk, which added extra protection, but also was a matter of status, all right, and general sort of mean of sort of showing off and being recognized for as an aristocrat, right, as an elite fighter. As far as the horse is concerned, usually we don't talk about that, if not in the historical military unit series, if not for the videos on the horses proper, because at the end of the day, there are, of course, more documentable types of fighters than of horses, even when we're talking about cavalrymen. So there will be some kind of video about the Islamic horse of this period in places like Syria, etc., in Ayyubid times and whereabouts. We can, however, say here, I included, of course, the horse as well, that the animal is equipped with a bard made of doubled felt. So an important padded caparison, providing, of course, some effective protection against arrows, as we were pointing out, also as far as the padded armor that was worn not just underneath the armor, but sometimes also above it, right? And horses were, generally speaking, not as armored as the riders historically since ever, right? You know that also pretty well from medieval times, and not only, however. In 13th century Europe, you know that full mail caparisons start appearing for the ultra heavier elite, right? We don't understand sometimes iconographically whether this armor is actual metal or depending on the artistic rendition sometimes, or I don't know, some organic material, etc. However, in the East, the idea that caparisons were more used also to isolate from temperatures, from parrying, from arrows, etc. is interesting. It's perhaps one of the few cases in which you can't say there was an Eastern influence in the eventual development, but it's sort of negligible as well. Naturally, here we're talking about pretty tough breeds capable of smashing to one another for the sake of, again, the aggression, combat, shock, charges, and so on. The Nihayat al-Sul, a 13th century Mamluk manual, details that such horse bards were sometimes stitched with small copper rings to deflect light sword strikes. Light swords, because, of course, heavier swords would essentially destroy that. And this is also the point of copper wasn't even that kind of resistant, but it's important compared, of course, to other metals used for armor. But in the sense is, of course, that the more it's a bit like the concept of brigandine. So if you look at for example, the description of this same 13th century Mongol armor, it was something more sort of heterogeneously primitive that it's normally thought, and Western sources probably relating to that, and all the solutions, the incredibly homemade solutions It would be literal for the Mongols had they had a home. In fact, because we're really looking, in fact, even in some fringes of the Islamic world here, as saying before, tribal warriors still properly being very primitive and very much connected with a very customized material culture that would be reflected in their panoplies, in their arms and armor, and so on. Of course, we have much less evidence for the lesser arms and armor. So in general, we can't be fully precise about everything. But sometimes iconographically, we see that where, of course, there are lots of artistic licenses. We see quite interesting stuff. This is more or less the picture. Of course, in the logic of this video is also not repeating all the kind of information. I mean, today we don't talk so much about swords that we just mentioned. For example, we hinted at before, considering the helmet dimension that would in part speak of the type of swords that were used at this point. We talked about them in many other contexts of military historical units and more. But there will be, of course, some Ayyubid, other type of Ayyubid heavy cavalry historical units that we will cover in an important level of depth. I see here that this is the 11th video about medieval Syrian warfare, about which I'm very glad. I see it especially in the last year, in this year actually, we made a couple of videos about medieval Syrian warfare. Here we add to properly the cavalry to the infantry element of the video we made last August about the Adat Syrian infantrymen. And so we're sort of building up the medieval Syrian army, right, and characterizing this area. Naturally, when you look at Schwerpunkt's playlist, etc., there are also scattered videos from several years of distance. We don't talk too often about medieval Syrian warfare. So, say the video, for example, the Adat Syrian infantrymen I made last year is not badly done. There isn't also too much to say about it because it's sort of a very basic idea. But let's say the more we go on, the more we enrich ourselves properly in the capacity to describe these words and to make something ever more uniform and homogeneous, etc., is our goal. We're sort of succeeding in this. We have seen, again, there's the video about medieval Syrian, Jaziran, and Iraqi warfare. There are mostly battles. We talked about medieval Maronites and Syrian Christian fighters as well, not just the Muslims. For the rest, Battle of Aran, al-Zard, Inab, these are all the Battle of Ager Sanguinis, Marjayun, that again we made just a couple of months ago. So again, there is really a lot. The Mongol logistics from the Al-Kamil invasion of Syria, which happened sort of several decades later, the period we're describing here with the Ayyubids, the 20s of the 13th century under Sultan Al-Kamil's rule. However, again, everything ties together with lots of other sort of content from the general region. For example, we made a lot also about ancient Syrian warfare. And so when you look at these playlists and you count all together, you can sort of flatten the differences. As long as there are few videos, you can say, oh, but I would like to hear this or that. And then when we gradually cover everything, we start being a bit more satisfied with the whole. And of course, this helps really a lot. I'm glad that probably we surpassed the most critical time of the August low views, and we're probably heading towards a much more impactful moment as far as our engagement is gonna go. We have the most intense part of the year ahead, as far as also the more rewarding one. In some ways, it's always hard, but let's say I'm glad to see that obviously this is an ever bigger system. And so we have an important capacity of recovery, of property of sedimenting further views, getting sort of more subscribers, a process of fidelization, which is definitely yielding its results. Naturally, it's increasingly challenging to have a YouTube channel in the current environment, right, online and in the world. But YouTube resists. Doesn't seem that the AI is also kind of breaking through any particular mold as far as views are concerned. Historical content is basically here. We are probably always going to remain somehow a niche channel, but this doesn't mean that our particularly large amount, say, of videos of niche topics can't in fact unite everything into some sort of, okay, that guy is the guy who explains medieval warfare, and as far as I'm concerned, I know, let's search Ayyubid cavalryman. Nobody, I think, it's possible somebody made something about Ayyubid cavalryman, but no, right? There are some channels, there are some guys from the more generic Ayyubid heavy infantry, from, you know, those guys who make dioramas, right, models of that. There is a lot of total war in many ways, and in general, however, there isn't really much at all. Ayyubid crossbowmen has sort of, from this channel, Imperator Vespasian, and it's just about dioramas and figurines and so on. So again, it's interesting. It's something which we don't have to sort of get afraid of in general to further browse. There is, however, also a lot of space again for it's as if we only began, right, with all this stuff, so we don't have to worry about making hills. I see a heavy Mamluk cavalry music video. This is interesting. This is always about total war here. I think it's unmistakable, or some other video game, and it's relatively stereotyped because, by the way, all these video games tend to have, I don't know whether it's just a choice for the video, but to have the boss, when you look at the troops, they're always the most elite, the shiniest, the most heavily armored, and so on. We have some videos by other channels that tend to single out specific historical military units, but now we have a pretty advanced capacity of making videos on our own, thanks to mostly the databases of expandable, copyrighted, sort of commercially usable content, but also AI. All right, and this is particularly interesting because you can model different guys in different ways, and I don't see anyone actually making videos like this. You would think that AI would basically saturate everything. Really not, right? They don't make content like this, which you may consider, of course, to be very primitive and homemade in technical terms, but that at least talks about these topics, because nobody seems to be particularly talking about them to begin with, and this is obviously not good, right? I am really glad, at least, that we're truly making it. We're truly building that interconnected system of videos that will really tell everything about medieval warfare in this encyclopedical depth, and we are just at the beginning. We haven't really gotten even into the midst of it all, and this is quite relevant, I think. As I was saying at the beginning, many of you asked me about Ayyubid warfare specifically. Let me check how many, because I created a playlist. There isn't much, but no, there isn't Ayyubid content. Actually, very few. Yeah, this may be actually with the Battle of Marjayun. Yes, there is also the Battle of At, and there is surely something else that we made about Ayyubid warfare that I can't remember. Some other crusade battle. Let me check. Surely something of that kind, but not specifically or explicitly about the Ayyubids for that matter. So we talk about Salah ad-Din in other sort of generic, also not military historical videos. So we should start actually, tomorrow we'll likely create an Ayyubid warfare playlist, because it is exactly what we need here to also attract more people, because there isn't really much about Ayyubid warfare, as we were saying before, in the broader environment as we were searching it even before. And so the Ayyubids, by the way, went on for a while, even up to the 14th century, but of course they were sort of dislodged, and the Mamluks wouldn't feel threatened by them, right? So mostly, again, especially in Syria, so they continued. And so, yeah, we didn't properly mate too much, but again, I'll create the playlist so you will at least know where to find this stuff in a more straightforward fashion, right? So I'm really glad that we could cover this, and we will go on along that pattern. There are, for example, the Adah, the infantrymen, those are overlapping, like Ayyubid, Fatimid before that, Mamluk times, etc., because it's from the 11th to the 13th century, so it's not really specifically Ayyubid. And I have to be precise about that instead, right? So that's the kind of standards I maintain for also the encyclopedical notions. In any case, for today, I stop it here. Just remember, you have always the medieval Islamic warfare playlist in a more generic sense. There's a lot about the Seljuks, a lot about other powers. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.